Rosie was a bright and curious 14-year-old girl who lived in a small, peaceful town. Her life revolved around school, her family, and her love for painting. She spent her days sketching in her notebook, practicing brushstrokes on canvases, and sharing her creations with her best friend, Mia. Her weekends were filled with bike rides around the neighborhood and evenings watching movies with her mom, Clara, a 38-year-old single mother who worked as a graphic designer. Rosie School was a traditional, strict institution that emphasized discipline and order. The students wore uniforms, and the school had a no-nonsense attitude toward hygiene and appearance. Rosie enjoyed her classes, especially art, where she felt she could express herself freely. One Monday morning, Rosie woke up feeling slightly itchy on her scalp. She brushed it off as nothing, thinking maybe it was just the dry winter air. She grabbed her usual outfit, a navy blue blazer and skirt with white stockings, and rushed out the door, barely making it to the school bus. She climbed onto the school bus just as the driver was about to close the doors. Breathing heavily, she found an empty seat near the middle and plopped down, clutching her bag to her chest. Around her, the chatter of students filled the air. Rosie adjusted her blazer and smoothed her skirt, trying to blend in. Her best friend, Mia, sat across the aisle and waved. "Hey, Rosie, you look tired?" "Did you sleep okay?" Rosie shrugged, forcing a small smile. "Not really. I kept waking up because my head was itching." Mia tilted her head curiously. "Itching? Like a lot?" Rosie nodded. "The end?" "Yeah, but I think it's just the cold weather drying out my scalp or something." She brushed her fingers lightly over her head, trying not to scratch. Mia gave her a concerned look, but didn't push further. "Well, maybe you should get it checked. Anyway, did you finish the math homework?" "I swear it was impossible." The rest of the bus ride passed with their usual banter, though Rosie kept feeling an uncomfortable itch at the back of her neck. She didn't want to think about it too much. As the bus pulled into the schoolyard, Rosie gathered her things and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The bell rang just as she entered the school building. She hurried to her locker, exchanged a few books, and made her way to her first class, English. The morning passed uneventfully, with Rosie trying her best to focus, despite the persistent itching. During the second period, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Attention students, the nurse will be conducting head checks today as part of our regular hygiene program. Teachers, please send your students to the nurse's office when called." Rosie froze. Her stomach tightened as whispers spread through the classroom. She remembered Mia's concerned look on the bus and felt a sudden wave of anxiety. Her name was called an hour later. The teacher pointed toward the door. "Rosie, it's your turn. Please head to the nurse's office." Rosie stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her classmates glanced at her, some giggling under their breath. She avoided eye contact and walked down the long hallway to the nurse's office, her heart pounding. When she arrived, Nurse Margaret greeted her with a brisk nod. "Come in, Rosie, sit down, and let's get started." Rosie hesitated before sitting on the small stool. The nurse tied a disposable cape around Rosie's neck and snapped on a pair of gloves. The sterile smell of the room made Rosie's nerves spike. Nurse Margaret began parting Rosie's hair with a comb, working methodically. "Let me know if you feel any discomfort," she said, her tone businesslike. Rosie nodded silently, gripping the edges of the stool. "You're welcome." The nurse's comb slowed as she examined a spot near Rosie's crown. Then she sighed, her voice tinged with concern. "Rosie," Nurse Margaret said, setting the comb down, "I need to be honest with you. You have lice." Rosie's breath caught in her throat. "Lice? Are you sure?" The nurse nodded firmly. "Yes, it's not uncommon, but we need to address it immediately to prevent it from spreading to other students." "What happens now?" Rosie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret explained, "School policy requires us to treat cases of lice promptly. For significant infestations, we follow our hygiene protocol, which includes removing the hair." "I'll need to shave your head." Rosie's eyes widened in shock. "Shave my head?" "No, you can't do that without telling my mom first." The nurse frowned. "I understand, but we must act quickly. This is a matter of school policy and public health." Rosie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Please, isn't there another way? My mom should know about this before you do anything." Margaret softened her tone, but remained resolute. "I understand how you feel, Rosie, but this is for your well-being and the safety of others." Margaret stood up and walked to a cupboard, pulling out a pair of clippers. The sound of them buzzing to life filled the room, and Rosie flinched. "I'll be as gentle as I can," Margaret said. Rosie's tears spilled over as she whispered, "I don't want this." Margaret placed a comforting hand on Rosie's shoulder. I know, sweetheart, but it's just hair. It'll grow back. I promise. Rosie clenched her fists as the nurse began shaving. The clippers glided over her scalp, sending locks of her dark brown hair falling onto the cape and floor. The sensation was strange and cold, and Rosie couldn't stop the sobs that escaped her lips. When it was over, Margaret handed her a mirror. Rosie stared at her reflection, her bare scalp shiny under the fluorescent lights. She barely recognized herself. Margaret tried to comfort her. You're brave, Rosie. You'll get through this. Rosie didn't respond. She wiped her tears and left the office, her head lowered, dreading what her classmates and especially her mother would say next. Rosie spent the rest of the school day in a haze. She avoided eye contact with her classmates, keeping her head down as much as possible. Whispers and giggles followed her wherever she went. But she tried to block them out. When the final bell rang, she hurried out of the classroom, clutching her bag tightly. She was one of the first students on the school bus, choosing a seat at the very back where she could stay out of sight. As the bus rolled through the neighborhood, Rosie's best friend, Mia, spotted her. Rosie, she called, walking down the aisle. When she saw Rosie's shaved head, her expression shifted from surprise to concern. Rosie, what happened? Mia asked, sitting beside her. Rosie turned away, tears brimming in her eyes. I don't want to talk about it, she whispered. Mia hesitated, but placed a comforting hand on Rosie's shoulder. I'm here if you need me, okay? Rosie nodded slightly, her gaze fixed on the window. When the bus finally stopped in front of her house, Rosie grabbed her bag and stepped off quickly, not waiting for Mia to say goodbye. As Rosie entered the house, her mother, Clara, immediately noticed something was wrong. She was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the door slam. Rosie. Is that you? Clara called, wiping her hands on a towel. She stepped into the hallway and froze when she saw her daughter. Rosie stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, her bald head gleaming under the light. Rosie, what happened? Clara's voice was a mix of shock and anger. She rushed to her daughter, cupping her face gently. They shaved my head, Rosie managed to say between sobs. Clara's eyes widened. Who? Why? What is going on? Rosie explained everything, her voice breaking as she recounted the nurse's decision to shave her head without calling Clara first. By the time she finished, Clara's face was red with fury. They did this without even telling me? Without asking for my permission? Clara's voice was sharp, her hands clenching into fists. Rosie nodded, sniffling. They said it was school policy. But I didn't want this, Mom. Clara pulled her daughter into a tight hug. This is unacceptable. They had no right to do this to you. I'm going to make sure they're held accountable. The next morning, Clara called the school and demanded an immediate meeting with the headmistress, Mrs. Thornton, and Nurse Margaret. When she arrived, she wasted no time. How dare you make such a drastic decision without consulting me? Clara's voice echoed through the office. Mrs. Thornton, a tall, stern woman in her 60s, remained composed. Mrs. Collins, the policy is in place to protect all students. In cases of severe lice infestations, immediate action is necessary. Clara shot back. Immediate action doesn't mean you get to strip my child of her dignity. You should have called me. This is a violation of my rights as a parent and Rosie's rights as a student. Nurse Margaret tried to interject. We understand your frustration, but we followed protocol, Clara interrupted. Your protocol is flawed, and I'm not letting this slide. I'm suing the school. The room fell silent. Mrs. Thornton's composed demeanor faltered. A few weeks later, the case went to court. Clara's lawyer presented a compelling argument, emphasizing how the school's actions had caused emotional distress to Rosie and violated Clara's parental rights. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a calm but authoritative presence, listened intently. After deliberating, she delivered her verdict. The school acted rashly and without proper communication with the parent. As a result, I rule in favor of the plaintiff. Furthermore, to address the emotional impact caused by this incident, I, Nurse Margaret, and Mrs. Thornton are required to shave their own heads as a symbolic act of accountability. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Clara's lips pressed into a satisfied line, while Rosie, sitting beside her, felt a small flicker of justice. The school organized an assembly to address the incident and demonstrate accountability. Students and staff gathered in the auditorium, buzzing with anticipation. Mrs. Thornton and Nurse Margaret sat on stage, both wearing solemn expressions. A barber stood behind them, clippers in hand. The room fell silent as the barber switched on the clippers. Starting with Nurse Margaret, he shaved her graying hair in smooth, even passes. Strands fell to the floor, and the nurse kept her gaze fixed ahead, her face stoic. Next, Mrs. Thornton took her place. The clippers hummed as her salt and pepper hair was removed, leaving her scalp bare. She closed her eyes, her expression unreadable. When it was over, the two women stood before the audience, their heads gleaming under the bright lights. At home, Rosie watched the recording of the assembly online. Her mother sat beside her, smiling faintly. "Justice was served, sweetie." Rosie ran a hand over her still bald scalp, feeling a mix of emotions. It doesn't change what happened, but it helps.